with politically. And I think one of the things that is also wrong with our immigration debate is it's often treated like a binary question. Are you for it or against it? Rather than should you have more or less? And one of the ways that center-left parties get in trouble is because they're never able to define what their limiting principle is. People on the left, especially in the United States, get irritated when you say, well, they're accused of being for open borders. We're not for open borders. Well, what are you for? Homina, homina, homina. Well, we think if someone comes here illegally and commits a series of serial murders and other atrocious crimes, then I think it's okay, what if it's just a lot of drunk driving violations? Homina, homina, homina. And when you can't say what your limiting principle is, people tend to assume you don't have one at all.
That seems fair, but on the left, very few people are in a principled manner open borders advocates. And I actually deeply respect the people who are, because I think there's some real moral considerations that lead towards that position, even if I ultimately don't embrace it, and they're open and coherent in their beliefs. And then there seem to be a lot of other people who both think it's absurd to accuse them of being in favor of open borders, but also demonize any expression of a belief that immigration should in some specific way be limited.
And what they communicate is at the test, when it comes time to make a decision, you will act as if you believed in open borders, whether you do or not. So a point here that needs stressing. The flow of immigration into the United States, never mind Europe, is not as great today as it was before the First World War. If you measure number of immigrants relative to the native population. But before the First World War, Americans were having lots of children of their own, and now they're below replacement. So even though the relationship of the flow of immigration to the stock of native population is less than it was before the First World War, its impact on the nature of the country is actually greater. We are in the mid-2020s going to overtake the previous peak for foreign-born in the population, which was 1890, and we're going to keep going forever under present policy. And because most American counties are losing population and immigrants are going to very, very few places, that their impact on the transformation of the places where they do come and the sectors of the economy where they do go is overwhelming. And you create a feeling in the native population that they are being displaced from their own country. And this is tremendously destabilizing. And liberals are able to see this when the driver of the feeling of displacement is that the rich are getting richer. They're able to see it when the driver of the displacement is the economy is becoming more concentrated in a few great cities and real estate prices are becoming more expensive, but they can't see
Well, ironically, they're even able to see it within neighborhoods. So liberals are very strongly against gentrification,
yes,
which is people from within the country but outside of a community coming in and rapidly changing the nature of a particular community.
Right, exactly. That's a fantastic example. And so you just need to begin by saying it's a source of stress. And the need to euphemize it and to say it's a wonderful thing and everybody loves it. It's the only free lunch policy there is. It is not a free lunch policy. It's a source of stress. Now, that doesn't mean that you endorse Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that you endorse nativism. And it doesn't mean that the correct answer is zero. But there's something tremendously arbitrary of saying, through Congress in 1990, for a variety of reasons having to do with the working out of the immigration amnesty of 1986, that the United States made a decision to have 1.1 million green cards every year. And thus it was spake in 1990. And so it is true and eternal forever that the number of green cards chosen in 1990 is the number we should have in 2019. I don't see how that makes any sense. And you should be able to rethink this.
So I have two sets of questions, or perhaps
one more thing about this. Meanwhile, we are having at the border an immigration surge. It's called asylum seeking, but it's, of course, people looking for work from Central America that is about to catch up to the surges of illegal immigration at the peak in the middle 1990s. If the present trends continue, we're going to have as many illegal immigrants arrive in the United States in 2019, or as many unauthorized, uninvited immigrants arrive in 2019 as arrived in the middle 1990s, the peak of the illegal immigration crisis.
So I have two sets of things that I want to think through here. The first is a set of questions about what the ideal system would look like. And then the second, which I think in some ways is the more substantive set of debates, the thing that I'm even more confused by about how to achieve it. So the first question I would have, I suppose, is whether the problem of immigration as you see it is mostly about how many immigrants there are, or whether it is mostly about their level of skill. I personally have started to see the force in the argument that some people make, which, by the way, in Germany and much of Europe is seen as a very left-wing argument. The Green Party within Germany was ridiculed a few years ago for suggesting this by most of the political mainstream that thought that this kind of policy was far too cosmopolitan. And that's essentially the Canadian model, which is to say that you give most green cards out on the basis of skill, because we have a belief that high-skilled people tend to integrate better, that they tend to have more successful offspring, that actually the huge majority of people who are often cited as the Nobel Prize winners and the founders of big corporations and all of those wonderful achievements tend to have come to the country on H-1B visas. And that rather than buying the far-right populist argument about immigration, which is that there are certain cultural groups that simply are less good at being members of our society. That if you import people from Mexico, Central Europe, but if you import people who are Muslim, they are going to be a big problem in this society. I don't see any evidence of that. What I do see evidence of is that immigrant groups that primarily tend to be recruited from H-1B visas or from close relatives of people who came here on H-1B visas, who are therefore also of a particular social class in the societies of origin, tend to do phenomenally well. That is the reason why Muslim Americans do better than the average in the United States population, especially if you take refugee populations out. That is the reason why Nigerian Americans are fantastically successful in the United States. It is the reason why some Mexicans and Central Americans do less well here, whereas the situation is reversed in Germany, where Turks who tend to have come as low-skill immigrants in the 60s do relatively poorly, but immigrants from Central and Latin America do very, very well. So why shouldn't we put more emphasis than you put in your remarks right now and when you put in the Atlantic article on shifting towards high-skill immigration?
I think we should do that, but I think numbers really do matter, because it is the numbers, the stress of immigration is it creates a dynamic where people grow middle-aged and old in a country that is very different from the country in which they grew up. And as they live longer and longer, this becomes more and more of a problem. We have a lot more reactionary 80-year-olds than we used to do. So you need to factor this in. Now, that doesn't mean that the people who are stressed get a veto over the policies of the society. Immigration is a very complicated, you're recruiting your human capital, and there are a lot of considerations. And I point to some very important ones, but there are others too. And I don't believe there's one ideal immigration policy. If people would just begin by accepting the idea, there are trade-offs, there are costs. It's a source of stress as well as a source of strength. And the numbers always make it harder. You know, if the United States were taking, instead of 1.1 million green cards a year, if we're taking 110,000, I think it would be impossible to get immigration policy wrong. It wouldn't matter very much. You take low-skilled, high-skilled, you could not mess it up. If you take 1.1, it's very hard to get it right. If you took 140,000, which is the number that we had between 1965 and 1990, it would be easier to get that number right. And by right, I mean meet all the requirements of meeting the country's need for skills, keeping the population stable because it would decline given present fertility without immigration, and also avoiding these xenophobic reactions.
Let me double click on that. You have a very striking line in the piece, which I will butcher, but goes something like, if we don't follow popular opinion on immigration, the population will hire fascists to do it for them.
If liberals won't enforce borders, the population will hire fascists to do it.
To what extent is your argument substantive and to what extent is it strategic? Which is to say, if we took that electoral consideration out of the picture, if we were not in any way worried about possible counter-reaction through people like Donald Trump, would you be making the same argument or not?
I would not, but let's understand how deeply radical a thing you just said. So the second greatest immigration destination on earth after the United States, not in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, the second greatest immigration destination is Russia. Russia is about as racist a country, as chauvinist a country as there is, but immigration is entirely uncontroversial in Russia. And not merely because you're not allowed to talk about things, because the Russians are an authoritarian state is able to subordinate people. The thing that makes immigration stressful is the democratic experience, that the promise that you come here, you're accepted, and you are as fully a citizen as anybody else. You have the same rights, the same right to participate. So it has always been, this is a staple of the political science of two generations ago, that authoritarian empires can be multi-ethnic, republicans cannot be. So yeah, it is a predictive argument, but it's also a substantive one. One of the things that bothers me a great deal about the policy that we've in fact followed, the United States has bred a subordinated, rightsless population. So I make this point in the article in The Atlantic. In 1970, something like 97% of the people living inside the United States were American citizens. And the 3% who were not were mostly very old. Grandma came from Italy, could never learned enough English to pass the citizenship exam, and so she's in the attic and she's not a citizen. And but it doesn't matter because the rising generations are.
And she's not in the attic hiding, just to avoid those connotations, which, as a German Jew, immediately came to my mind.
Right. Yeah, but she's right. She's still in the old country, even though she's living in the new. Right. But 97% of people resident inside the United States were citizens. So today, I think the figure is about 90. But in many parts of the country, the figure is much lower. And you have this situation where, in large parts of the United States, substantial minorities of the people in a town or community are people who are not citizens, and they occupy, and this is, I find something that this is thinking like a lawyer, which I used to be, legally trained person. They occupy a spectrum of statuses that, a republic has citizens and it has non-citizens. But in the United States, we have citizens, we have permanent residents who have every right except the right of political participation. We have people on various temporary visas who have the right to live but not to change jobs. They have to go through a process of paperwork to change jobs. We have students who are not allowed to work. We have people who are here illegally but have a temporary protected status. We have a DACA population